Fought only by Americans, the Civil War is the bloodiest war in American history. It was fought between the southern states who were looking to secede from the Union, and the northern states who were doing everything possible to keep them from doing so. This is Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States during the war, and Jefferson Davis, the Confederate President. Here is Fort Sumter, where it all began. Fort Sumter was a Union fort in South Carolina, one of the first states to secede to the Confederacy. When the Confederates demanded Fort Sumter's surrender, Lincoln wouldn't abandon the fort, but neither would he properly defend it. In response, Davis ordered an attack on the fort. The attack was successful, and without either side suffering any casualties, the Confederacy now held Fort Sumter. However, letting the fort fall was a smart move on Lincoln's part. A war had begun, but Lincoln had tricked the opposing side into firing the first shots. Soon afterwards, the United States government developed a plan that they believed would win them the war quickly. It was called the Anaconda Plan. The plan was to blockade all of the South's ports, secure the Mississippi River, and go on to capture Richmond, the Confederate capital. The plan was called Anaconda because it attempted to metaphorically strangle the South, which was trying to hold its own as a separate nation. Bull Run, the first battle in the Civil War where blood was shed. Union soldiers wore blue uniforms while their Confederate counterparts wore gray. It is now known as a seesaw battle because originally the Union had the upper hand. However, the Confederates were able to hold them off and push them back out. This early victory was a huge morale boost for the South. The North wouldn't stay down for long. President Lincoln declared all Southern slaves the Union Army came across to be free under the Emancipation Proclamation. His reasoning was that Southern slaves were considered property and could therefore be confiscated as war resources. Once captured slaves arrived in the North, they were given the choice to either live out their lives as free men and women or join the Union Army, as many of the men did. Lincoln wanted to maintain the support of slave states that were still part of the Union, so Northern slaves were not emancipated. The Civil War was without a doubt a poor man's war. The Confederate Army began drafting new soldiers in 1862 and the Union Army 1 year later in 1863. However, wealthier men could buy their way out of the draft. This meant that many of the soldiers fighting in the war were the men who were too poor to pay their way out of conscription. Still, a high number of soldiers were volunteers who joined their respective armies to fight for various causes. But not everyone agreed with the causes that Abraham Lincoln claimed they were fighting for. A number of people opposed freeing the Southern slaves, especially Irish immigrants who believed that the freed slaves were going to take their jobs when they came up north. Fearful people started riots, the worst of which was in New York City. Battlefield medicine was especially poor. If a soldier survived getting shot in a limb, that limb would most likely be amputated. This is because it was extremely difficult to safely remove a bullet from the body. Oftentimes, the tools used for these operations were not properly sanitized. This was very dangerous and led to the spread of disease and infection among wounded soldiers. But if a soldier did die, the methods for preserving his body and sending him back home to his family vastly improved. These methods included embalming and using airtight coffins, both of which protected the body against natural decay. In July 1863, the three-day Battle of Gettysburg was the turning point of the Civil War, crippling Lee so badly that he would never dare go north again. The Confederates, needing shoes, were preparing to raid a shoe factory near Gettysburg when they ran into Northern troops. The Union had the high ground, but Lee managed to force them back to a ridge with heavy cannon fire. By the second day, the Union was running low on ammo, but continued to charge the Confederates with bayonets. By the third day, Lee was forced to retreat, never to come north again. In November 1863, Abraham Lincoln prepared and delivered one of the most famous speeches in American history. The Gettysburg Address, read at a ceremony dedicating a cemetery to all of the fallen soldiers of the Battle of Gettysburg, soldiers from both sides. This was the speech that made many Americans realize that the U.S. was not simply a collection of states, but one single nation. After losses at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, Confederate morale was at an all-time low. Meet William Sherman, a young general appointed by Grant. Focusing on Georgia, Sherman employs tactics of total war, a scorched earth policy not yet seen during the Civil War. Sherman and his men marched through Georgia, destroying anything in their path. They took what they wanted and were very careful not to leave anything useful that the South could use later. Sherman's men also made sure to destroy as many Southern railroad lines as possible, cutting off Southern soldiers from the support they needed. Sherman and his men were moving towards Atlanta, which they burned to the ground upon their arrival, and went on to burn most of Savannah as well. Sherman then headed north to assist Grant, continuing to destroy everything he could find. Sherman stuck to his total war policy on his march through South Carolina, and didn't stop burning everything in sight until he reached North Carolina, and only because he thought the war was coming to an end. While Sherman was on his rampage through the South, Abraham Lincoln was having difficulty with his re-election campaign in 1864. He faced much opposition from both Democrats and Republicans, and only won with a 55% majority. But on April 9, 1865, in a private home in Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, an agreement was made between Grant and Lee. Terms were generous in the favor of the South, as the North was willing to help them rebuild everything destroyed during Sherman's march. Lee agreed to these terms, officially ending the war. The Civil War was the source of many technological advances, one of which was a new kind of bullet, the mini-ball. There are two things that made this bullet especially successful, the first of which is the grooves on the inside of the barrel of the gun, called rifling, which spin the bullet, making it fly straighter than it normally would. But the most important thing about the bullet was its shape. Its shape made it fly straighter than any other bullet that had been used before, and it killed at a much farther distance. It also caused an alarming amount of damage to the human body. This was the bullet that killed over 600,000 American soldiers. During the later years of the Civil War and the year after, Lincoln worked to have an amendment passed that would abolish slavery in America. The amendment passed with 2 votes to spare, and by the end of 1865, 27 states had ratified it. But, unfortunately, Lincoln never got to carry out whatever plans he may have had for the nation. On April 14, 1865, 26-year-old John Wilkes Booth assassinated Abraham Lincoln at Ford's Theater. Booth broke his leg jumping down from the balcony, but still managed to escape. He was found and killed 12 days later. Over 7 million Americans publicly mourned Lincoln's death, and he remains one of the most beloved and respected presidents even today.